Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking IAA for organizing this event and all of you for coming. It should be a great discussion. I'm in a moment going to share my screen so that you can begin to see the exciting PowerPoint presentation that I have for this book. And then I will shut down the share screen once I'm done with my presentation so that we can all see each other again. So let's see if we can make this happen. And up on the screen is the cover of my book, which was published by Oxford University Press just a couple months ago. It perhaps was not great timing to publish a book about freedom of movement right at the time that many of us all over the world were under lockdown. It is my hope that over time, this horrible crisis, if it has any good effects at all, one small one might be that we might come to appreciate freedom of movement of various kinds more than perhaps some of us did before. So the focus of the book is the ways in which voting with your feet can enhance people's political freedom. In the first part of the presentation, I'll talk about some of the advantages that foot voting has over ballot box voting, which is the mechanism of political choice that most of us tend to think is the primary one. I'll also take a closer look at the three types of foot voting that are covered in the book. One is foot voting within a federal system where people can choose where to live in a regional or local government based in part at least on the government policies in those areas. Another is foot voting in the private sector, which many people don't even think of as a potentially political choice at all, but as I'll explain, it actually can be. And finally, foot voting through international migration, which of course is the most controversial type, but is also the one where there are the greatest possible gains. And then finally, I'll look at some objections that can be raised against different types of foot voting, particularly the international migration kind. But as we'll see, most of the objections that can be raised against one type of foot voting actually also apply to other types as well, if you take them seriously. One of the points that I want to make in the book actually is that these different types of foot voting, while in the previous academic literature, they tend to be discussed separately, in reality, they have important commonalities. So first things first, why should we even think of foot voting as an important mechanism of political choice? After all, most people would say that the way we choose the government policies we get to live under, that's at the ballot box. Like, for instance, in the US presidential election that was just completed, though perhaps saying it's completed is premature in certain respects, given that obviously there are legal disputes, however frivolous, that are still going on. So I think ballot box voting does have important advantages, but it also has two significant limitations. One is that the chance that your vote will actually have a decisive effect in an election is infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million, though it can be somewhat higher in a swing state, and contrary-wise, a lot lower if you live in a state which is not a swing state. In a UK general election, the odds are somewhat higher, but there's still many millions to one. And the same thing can be said for various local or state elections in the US. The odds that your vote will make a difference are higher than in a presidential election, but still very, very low. In most contexts, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice in a situation where your decision has only a 1 in 60 million or even a 1 in 1 million chance of making a difference. We would not say you have meaningful political freedom in a situation, we would not say you have meaningful freedom of speech in a situation where you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what ideas you're allowed to express. Similarly, we would not say you have meaningful religious freedom in a situation where you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine which faith you want to practice. And I would suggest the same thing applies to political freedom. It is not actually meaningful, or at least there's not very much of it, if you have only a 1 in a million or a 1 in 60 million chance of being able to determine what government policies you're going to have to live under. The American Medical Association says that before a doctor is allowed to treat you, they must have your informed consent. You must know what the treatment is going to be and what the likely effects are. As we've all seen during the COVID crisis, government policies are often also literally matters of life and death, just like medical treatment often is. And that, by the way, is true even in normal times where the life and death nature of government policy may not always be so obvious, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. But yet, when you ask whether the government has the informed consent of the people when they vote at the ballot box, in the vast majority of instances, the answer is no. The reason for that is that precisely because when you vote at the ballot box, there's so little chance that your vote will make a difference. It is the case that you have an incentive to spend little or no time acquiring relevant political information, and even less time, perhaps, carefully considering its implications. And so, as I discuss in this book, and in greater detail in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, overwhelmingly, most ballot box voters actually know very little about the issues that they're voting on. For example, only about a third of Americans can even name the three branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. There's also a lot of evidence that they often don't know even very basic facts about specific aspects of government policy. And this is a problem that is far from unique to the United States. We have survey evidence, for example, about political knowledge in the UK as well, and it looks remarkably similar to the picture in the United States. I'm happy to talk about that in the questions if people are interested. So it turns out, therefore, that ballot box voting has two major drawbacks. First, there is very little chance that your vote will actually make a difference. And second, precisely for that reason, it tends to be poorly informed. In the book, I go through a number of different leading theories of political freedom and show how these two general weaknesses of ballot box voting translate into serious problems under those theories of political freedom as well. And I'm happy to go through the different theories in the questions. Flip voting has important advantages over ballot box voting on both of these dimensions. When you decide what state or local government you want to live under or what country you want to move to through international migration, if you're allowed to make that choice at all, it is one that is actually highly likely to make a difference. And for that very reason, you are likely to make a much more serious effort to seek out relevant knowledge. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time and effort the last time you decided what television set to buy or what smartphone to get than the last time you decided who to vote for in any national election or indeed in any election of any kind. That's not because your television set is somehow more important than who governs your country or that the TV set deals with more complicated issues. It's that you know that the TV set you choose is likely to be the one that will actually end up in your living room. On the other hand, when you turn on the TV and you have the misfortune of seeing the president of the United States or some other powerful politician, the chance that you can affect who that is infinitesimally small, and therefore you likely devote only relatively little time and effort to seeking out information about that decision. I'd like to next take a closer look at the three different types of foot voting that are covered in the book, starting with foot voting under federal systems, which I think is the most familiar type, that when people decide where to live in a federal system, that potentially can offer tremendous advantages in terms of voting with your feet and in terms of political freedom. In the United States, we have 50 different state governments and many thousands of local governments. This offers a much wider range of choice to foot voters that is available simply through ballot box voting in national elections, where we generally have only just the two major parties you can choose from. In the UK, things are somewhat more difficult because the UK is a more centralized system than most other countries in Europe, certainly than the US. Philip Booth, who is in attendance today, has an excellent book called Federal Britain, where he discusses ways in which political power in the UK can be decentralized so as to allow for greater freedom of choice. And he explicitly discusses in that book how that can translate into greater opportunities for foot voting. Obviously, of course, the European Union offers tremendous opportunities for foot voting, and there are many millions of people who have taken advantage of that. In the aftermath of Brexit, I hope, though I'm not tremendously optimistic, that the UK and the European Union can reach some sort of agreement to restore at least some substantial degree of freedom of movement and therefore freedom of choice within that system. Disadvantage of foot voting under federalism exists even if the jurisdictions in question aren't making any special effort to compete with each other for residents. It can exist simply if they're just offering a diversity of options, either at random or just because they want to please the people who are already within their region. But obviously things can be even better if local and regional governments do compete with each other. And in the book, I discuss a variety of ways that incentives for that kind of competition can be increased. And I'm happy to talk about that in the questions as well. Historically, both in the United States and in many other countries, foot voting in federal systems has been a particular benefit to the poor and the oppressed. For the poor, it is often a tremendous mechanism for economic opportunity. For oppressed minorities and others, it's often a way to move to jurisdictions that are more tolerant and also offer greater opportunities as well. That's true in the US, for example, for the history of African Americans moving to jurisdictions where there was relatively less racial discrimination. It's true of women in the 19th century moving to states which offered more in the way of equal rights. And it's true more recently for the gay and lesbian community, which often took advantage of the fact that some jurisdictions were more favorable in their policies than others. And there are many similar examples in other federal systems around the world. In recent years, both in the US and in other countries, a number of obstacles have emerged that have made it more difficult, particularly for the poor, to move around freely to those areas where there's greater opportunities. The biggest obstacle in the US, and also a serious problem in the UK, is exclusionary zoning, which makes it extremely difficult to build new housing in response to demand, and thereby prices the poor and often even the lower middle class out of areas where otherwise they could find good job opportunities and other benefits as well. In the book, I propose ways to break down some of these barriers to foot voting and make it more available than previously to the poor and disadvantaged. It is also the case that greater decentralization of government power can make foot voting easier by reducing moving costs. It's often cheaper and easier to move to a nearby town than to move to an entirely different region of the country, for example. I'd next like to go on to talk about foot voting in the private sector. Many people would argue that this isn't really a form of foot voting at all, or at least they don't think of it as a possibility. But in reality, there are many institutions, both in the US and in other countries, that are in the private sector, but offer goods and services similar to those provided by regional or local governments. The most common example is private planned communities, condominium associations, homeowners associations, and others, which often offer education, environmental services, infrastructure, and other benefits that are traditionally associated with local and regional governments. In the United States, we have almost 70 million people who already live in private planned communities. They're also common in Canada and many European countries as well. A standard criticism of them is that really only the wealthy can afford to do this, that this is just the rich walling themselves off from the rest of society. That just isn't the case unless you believe we have 70 million wealthy people in the US. It isn't the case in other countries either. However, I do recognize that this form of organization often is not as readily available to the poor. And in the book, I propose various reforms that would make it more available, including reforms to housing permits and the like, and other plans that would make it easier to organize new private planned communities of various kinds. Foot voting in private planned communities has considerable advantages even over foot voting in federal systems. One advantage is that, as a general rule, you can fit more private institutions than regional or local governments within a given area, so they offer a wider range of choice. There is also a lot of evidence indicating that the quality of services offered by private planned communities and other similar institutions is actually often better than that provided by regional or local government. So it can improve the quality of services that people have as well. What's true for private planned communities is also true for many other kinds of foot voting in the private sector. For example, private school choice that can empower people to choose between different types of private schools, as well as potentially public ones. We also have private security services that offer some of the same kinds of services as local police. And I would add, in view of the recent crisis and problems over police abuse in the US, that private security services, including those provided by planned communities, on the whole have a better record of not abusing the public than public police do. And if they do abuse you, they do not enjoy privileges such as qualified immunity that makes it almost impossible to sue them in court for their abusive behavior. So there is that advantage as well. It is not my claim that the private sector can fully displace regional or local governments. And for that matter, I don't believe that regional or local governments can fully displace central governments. There are some problems that are so large scale that they can only be addressed by national governments, or even in cases like global warming, perhaps only internationally. However, a great deal of decentralization is possible in both the US and the UK and other countries than it currently exists. Many of the best governed nations in the world, countries like Switzerland, New Zealand, and others, are the same size as many relatively small US states. If these countries can have their own education policy, their own healthcare policy, and so forth, and so there's no reason why Virginia or New York or California couldn't do the same thing. And similarly, there are many ways in which policy can be decentralized to the local level or to the private sector as well. And if that is done, that would open up many more opportunities for foot voting, both in federal systems and also within the private sector as well. The most controversial type of foot voting is foot voting through international migration. Obviously, backlash against this played a role in the rise of Donald Trump, arguably also in the Brexit vote in the UK, and in the rise of nationalist populist movements in a number of countries around the world. Nonetheless, despite the opposition, the gains from this kind of foot voting are simply enormous. The reasons for that is that the differences in quality of governments between nations is far larger than any difference that might exist within a country. So think of whatever you believe is the best governed American state and compare it to whatever you think is the worst. There's probably a significant difference, but it's very small compared to the difference between the US and Mexico, to say nothing of such things as the difference between the US and Cuba, or the US and Syria, or most European countries and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and so forth. So when people leave oppressive and poor and corrupt societies and move to societies in the West and elsewhere, which are more advanced and freer, the gains in virtually any type of human freedom are simply enormous. Think of refugees fleeing totalitarian Cuba to come to the US. Almost immediately upon arrival, they experience a vast increase not only in political freedom, but in almost every other type of freedom as well. The same thing is true for Syrian refugees admitted to the US or to other Western nations, where they thereby are able to escape a brutally oppressive regime, but also violence and terrorism by groups like ISIS and others. And you can say similar things about people fleeing oppression in many places around the world. I would add that about 1/3 of the world's population lives under authoritarian regimes. And for those people, they don't even have the very limited political freedom provided by ballot box voting. For most of them, foot voting through international migration is the only mechanism by which they might have any opportunity for political freedom at all. It's very hard to quantify these gains in political freedom and other kinds of freedom, but they are truly enormous by any conceivable metric, whether qualitative or quantitative. In addition to the expansion of freedom, free international migration also has tremendous economic gains. Economists estimate that if we had full freedom of movement throughout the world, we could roughly double world GDP. That is, the world would be twice as wealthy as it currently is. The reason for that is that there are so many millions of people who are trapped in societies where the government is so oppressive, so dysfunctional, or so corrupt that no matter how smart those people are or how hardworking, they have little, if any, chance of ever escaping poverty. Whereas when such a person moves to a freer and wealthier society, they almost immediately become more productive. For example, when a Mexican or a Central American enters the US, they become 2 or 3 times more productive almost immediately, and that doesn't take into account improvements in their skills that could happen over time, and opportunities for improvement also tend to be greater in the US than in the countries of origin of most immigrants. So when you add all of it up, it's a simply tremendous set of economic gains. Now, obviously, despite the enormous gains, there are a variety of objections to expanded migration rights. And in the book, I divide these objections into 2 general categories. The first category is that some people argue that national governments have a general right to exclude people. They don't necessarily have to have a good reason. They can just say no for almost any reason that they want. Then there's a second category of arguments which say maybe there isn't a general right to exclude, but sometimes it's justifiable to exclude people to deal with specific types of problems, such as, for example, overburdening the welfare state or increasing crime, or that immigrant voters might vote for the wrong types of politicians and therefore cause harmful government policies. I'll start first with the arguments for a general right to exclude. And the most common variant of an argument like that is the one that's on the screen right now, that the true owners of a particular area of the world are the dominant ethnic or racial or cultural group. So up on the screen is a French nationalist poster which says, France is for the French, it's for the ethnically French people, therefore they can exclude other people if they want to, especially the English, but also the Germans, the Italians, North Africans, and so forth. And similarly, you can say Germany for the Germans, you can say Russia for the Russians, and so on. This sort of argument doesn't work so well for the United States, for example, because if there's any indigenous group which are the true owners of the land, it might be Native Americans who can potentially expel the rest of us. It may not even work that well for the United Kingdom, given the successive waves of invaders of various kinds, such as the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons, and so forth. So it's not really entirely clear who, if anybody, are the true indigenous people of the United Kingdom who are entitled to keep out everybody else. But even setting aside such historical issues, this sort of argument has severe flaws on its own terms. In the book, I go through several. Here, I'll just mention what may be the single biggest one. That if you take this argument seriously, it's a justification for racial and ethnic discrimination. In most other contexts, we recognize that governments should not be able to discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity, because race and ethnicity are morally arbitrary characteristics that people have no control over. You can't control whether you were born black or white, or whether you were born Hispanic or an Anglo. Similarly, you can't control whether you were born English or French, and so forth. And whether you were born black or white or English or French, it tells us nothing about how good a person you are, or how much freedom you should be entitled to. So we certainly recognize that in a domestic context where virtually everyone condemns, for example, racial segregation as it was historically practiced in the US, or apartheid in South Africa, where the region you're allowed to live in was determined by what racial group you belong to. And we readily recognize that the reason for that is that race and ethnicity are morally arbitrary characteristics that should not dictate how much freedom people have. If this is true domestically, then it should also be true internationally. There's no good reason why race and ethnicity and racial enacted discrimination, which are wrong and unjust in a domestic context, suddenly become perfectly fine when they're done in the context of international migration. The exact same objections readily apply. Moreover, even if you have a system which restricts migration based on place of birth or parentage, and it doesn't base it on race or ethnicity, still you run into the problem that it looks remarkably like the way the feudal system worked. So under the feudal system, if you were a noble, the people on the left, you could live largely where you wanted and you could move around freely. On the other hand, if you were a serf, you were only allowed to move around if the nobles let you. And what was the difference between the nobles and the serfs? Well, it depended on who your parents are. If you were the son or the daughter of a noble, you could live relatively freely. If you were a serf, tough luck. You had to stay where you are unless the nobles freed you or otherwise permitted you to move around. What we have at the international level today is a kind of modern day feudalism. People who are lucky enough to live in relatively wealthier and more advanced societies, at least to a large extent, can live where they want. On the other hand, if you're born in a poor and oppressive society, you're like a serf. You can't move around freely unless the nobles let you. And very often their answer is no, we don't want to let you. And if this was wrong in the feudal system, as almost everybody now recognizes, it seems to me that it's also wrong in the context of international migration, and for much the same reasons. Now, many people, particularly in the United States, they argue for a general right to exclude, not on the basis of race or culture or ethnicity or parentage, but rather on the theory that there is an analogy between a national government and the owner of a house or the members of a private club. So a private homeowner can exclude strangers from their house, and they don't necessarily have to have a good reason. Similarly, the members of a private club, they can exclude potential future members and also don't have to have a good reason. For example, I can have a club that's purely for fans of American football and fans of what is known as football in the UK and other countries. I could exclude them, even though fans of what is internationally known as football are not necessarily worse people than American football fans or somehow morally inferior. So similarly, you could then say, well, national governments can exclude people on the same basis. In the book, I go through a number of weaknesses of this argument. I'll focus on just the single biggest right now, which is that if you take this theory seriously, it has dire implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. Consider that the owner of a private house has the right to determine what kind of speech is permitted in their house. I can say only pro-Republican speech is permitted, or only pro-Democratic speech, pro-labor or pro-conservative. Similarly, they can determine what religion will be practiced in their house. I can say it's only the religion I approve of, only Christianity or only Islam. And you can say the same thing for clubs. You can certainly have a Republican club or a conservative club or a labor club, similarly a Muslim club or a Christian club, and so on. So if the authority of national governments is reasonably analogous to that of private homeowners or that of private club members, then those governments can have pretty much totalitarian powers over speech, religion, and many, many other things. And it seems to me that that's by itself a sufficient reason to reject this particular analogy and therefore conclude that nations are not like houses and they're not like private clubs either. There are some objections to expanded migration rights which don't depend on a general right to exclude, but rather raise particular types of specific problems, such as overburdening the welfare state, or what scholars call political externalities, the fear that immigrant voters will vote for bad politicians and adopt harmful government policies. I know it's difficult to believe, but if too many of the wrong kinds of people enter the US and get the right to vote, they might vote in a president who has no appreciation whatsoever for liberal democratic values and constantly tweets horrible things and otherwise expresses his admiration for dictators. That might be difficult to believe, but such a thing could potentially happen. And there are a variety of other objections of this type as well. In the book, I go through many such objections in detail. Here, I'll just present my general framework for dealing with them, which is a three-part approach. First, we should ask, how big a problem is this really? Often it turns out that it's not much of a problem at all. For example, it turns out that having a higher percentage of immigrants in your national population does not actually increase welfare spending per capita. Evidence from Europe actually suggests it may decrease it. Evidence from American states suggests it's roughly a wash. The same thing is true for claims that immigration increases crime. At least in the US and Canada, immigrants actually have much lower crime rates than natives. The evidence in Europe is more disputable and equivocal, but it still seems like it doesn't cause a significant increase in crime, though it might a little bit at the margin. But let's say there really is a significant problem, and I don't doubt that in some cases there could be. In that situation, I would go to the second question that should be asked, which is there a keyhole solution? That is a way to address the issue through means less draconian and harmful than keeping people out entirely. And in a wide variety of instances, there are actually fairly simple keyhole solutions. For example, in the case of immigrants potentially overburdening the welfare state, you can do more of what the US and some other governments do already, which is limit their eligibility for certain welfare benefits. That way, people can enter, be productive, get more freedom and contribute to society, but they collect less in the way of welfare benefits than they would otherwise. Similarly, if your concern is that immigrant voters will vote for the wrong types of politicians, you can again do more of the same thing that the US and I think also the UK already do, which is in the US, for example, immigrants cannot become citizens eligible to vote for at least 5 years. And even then, they must pass a civics test that most native-born Americans would fail. If they had to take it, you can potentially make the 5-year period longer, you can make the test harder, and so forth. Though in actual fact, when you compare immigrant political attitudes to those of natives in the US on most issues, the gap is actually relatively small. But if you think it's big and that there's some danger there, then the keyhole solution is readily available. But what if you get a situation where there is a genuine problem and for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like there's a keyhole solution available? In that scenario, I would ask the third question, which is there a way we can tap the vast wealth created by migration to alleviate the problem? For instance, let's say you worry that immigrant workers will depress the wages of certain categories of native workers. The literature on this actually suggests that most native workers benefit from increased migration, but there certainly can be a subset that does not or that loses wages. In the US, that tends to be high school dropouts, that they tend to lose out. If you think that's unjust, or should be alleviated for whatever reason, you can tax some of the extra wealth created by migration and increase wage subsidies to whatever category of workers you think deserve them. In the US, we can do that through the earned income tax credit system. There are other programs in other countries that work similarly. And I have similar tapping the wealth ideas to alleviate other claimed negative side effects of migration. And most of these mechanisms are relatively simple and can be enacted using existing government programs. I wrote this book before the coronavirus crisis, but my three-part approach actually works quite well for the danger of spreading disease across international lines. The data on whether international travel restrictions can actually reduce the spread of disease is actually quite equivocal. It may be that it can't do much, but even if it can, there is a simple keyhole solution, which is already being used by countries like South Korea, which has handled the COVID crisis far better than the US or the United Kingdom. Simply impose a 14-day quarantine on newly arriving immigrants. By that time, either it's clear that they don't have the disease, or if they did have it previously, they will no longer be contagious. In an article that I published in The Atlantic a couple months ago, I also explained why this is likely to be much more effective than categorical bars on various kinds of migration. Among other things, categorical exclusion predictably leads to the creation of a large illegal population, which in turn, if they get the virus, has very little incentive to report for testing or otherwise make it known to the authorities, because if they do come to the attention of the authorities, they might get deported. It is also the case that in the US, our immigration detention facilities are horrible breeding grounds, both for COVID and other diseases as well. If we adopt my kind of approach, we wouldn't have to have those detention facilities, and the problem would be solved. The last point that I would like to make is that virtually all the arguments that I just mentioned as objections to international migration, they can easily apply to internal freedom of movement as well. If you think that the United States is like a club, why not Virginia or Texas? If you think that that the dominant ethnic group of a country should be able to exclude people, why can't the Welsh, for example, exclude people from Wales exclude people from other parts of the United Kingdom who might want to come to Wales but are not ethnically Welsh? If you believe that countries can exclude people for the fear that they might overburden the welfare state, the same thing can be true for wealthy regions that might want to exclude people who move in from poorer regions within a particular nation. And you can go down the list of objections, and in pretty much every case, you can use it to justify severe restrictions on internal freedom of movement. So if you're not willing to bite that bullet, you may want to rethink how much you're committed to these kinds of theories as justifications for restricting international migration. It is not my view that no migration restrictions can ever be justified. I don't think any right can possibly be completely absolute, including even for internal migration. However, I think there should be a strong presumption against these restrictions, and that before we enact them, there should be a very heavy burden of proof. On that note, I conclude.